You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 13th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme... Protests rock Argentina, and there are also demonstrations in Ecuador. We'll get more detail about the unrest in Latin America. Then... Britain's Labour Party, all but guaranteed to be the next UK government, has launched its manifesto. What's in it? What will the UK, post nearly 14 years of rule by the Conservatives, look like? The Chinese premier's in New Zealand. We'll get more on this first state visit to the country in 7 years. Plus... Nigeria, we hail thee, our own dear native land. Nigerians are up in arms about the change to the national anthem. We'll find out why people are not singing its praises. And finally, on the global countdown ahead of the Euros, we'll hear the hits from the countries participating in the football matches. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. Demonstrators have taken to the streets outside the Congress in Buenos Aires, protesting against President Javier Milei's controversial economic reform package. Well, Andrew Thompson, a Latin American specialist and Latin news contributor, joins us now. Andrew, many thanks for coming on The Briefing. What's contained within this new package?
Well, it's really the same package that's been discussed for the last 6 months, except it's much diluted. The key thing is that it gives the president 1 year authority to take a whole series of drastic economic measures without needing to come back to Congress for each of them. So it will allow him to privatize public companies, to change labour legislation to make it easier to hire or fire workers. It will allow him to offer major incentives to foreign companies to invest in Argentina. And it will also pave the way for changes to pensions, which are likely to be cut in real terms.
And why is this quite radical plan necessary?
I think it's necessary because for decades, Argentina has run fiscal deficits and built up high levels of debts, which has made the country uncompetitive. And some form of restructuring has really been avoidable. Under this president, who's a member of the far right, it's perhaps more dramatic and abrupt than it would be under any other government. He did win the elections waving a chainsaw around, saying he was going to take the chainsaw to cut state bureaucracy and spending. So in that sense, he's being true to his electoral promises.
So people are objecting. They clearly don't think this is the right way to go about it. Tell us more.
Well, essentially, if you are, to put it crudely, if you are a banker or international investor, Milei is doing all the right things, and he is radically cutting the fiscal deficit, which in the first 3 months of this year has for the first time been in surplus, first time in about 2 decades. If, however, you are an Argentine teacher, worker, member of the middle classes, the degree of the restructuring is absolutely drastic. In a country with inflation above 200% still, although it's coming down, what the government has been doing is to allow inflation eat away the real purchasing power of public sector workers and people who receive pensions. And the scale of that cutback is absolutely dramatic. For example, pensioners are seeing their monthly pension fall by 30 to 40% in real terms. Public sector employees, who are at the forefront of a lot of the demonstrations, are seeing a similar kind of reduction. So it does, there's the cliche, this is, surgery without anesthesia. And it does look like that in Argentina, which explains perhaps why the new president is both popular with the sections of the middle classes and the wider population, and why at the same time there's a hardcore of opposition which just is trying to reject the level of these cutbacks.
The scene outside Parliament was described as like a battlefield. Can you tell us more?
Yes, well, essentially various opposition groups had called for a demonstration, and that was in the plaza outside the main Congress building. And there were very quickly clashes between the protesters and the police. It seems the protesters were divided into two groups. There was the peaceful protesters and those who appeared wearing hoodies and throwing Molotov cocktails. So there was a major confrontation. The police used pepper spray, it used high-power water cannon and tear gas. Ironically, perhaps, a group of 9 members of Congress, mainly from the opposition party, emerged to see what was going on, and they were seriously affected by pepper gas and had to be hospitalized. About 3 cars were burnt, and there were various other, attacks on shops and things like that. And that was, if you like, the hardcore of more violent protesters, while other protesters sought to keep the process peaceful.
I wonder what happens to the bill next, and if these protests are enough to reverse it or water it down even further.
It looks as if, despite what I've been saying, this is a sort of political triumph for the new government. It was incredibly close. There are 72 members of Congress, and the vote was 36 to 36. And it was left to the Speaker of the Senate, who is also Argentina's vice president, to cast the casting vote, so to speak, to get it through. Now, this is all, it's the way Congress works in Argentina. Members of Congress vote first in principle and then in particular. So in particular is when they vote line by line on new laws. And where we are now is that the omnibus law has been approved by the deputies. That was last April. It's now been approved by the Senate with some changes, and that modified version of the law has to go back to the Chamber of Deputies for final approval. But it does look as if the government has just managed to cross the line and will therefore start enforcing these additional policy powers. I think the outlook will continue to be one of confrontation for some time yet, and while the government has made the changes it wanted to make, it will continue to face trade union protests. One of the issues here is that the president is not really an experienced politician and is very adversarial, and really, in almost like Trump-like fashion, likes stirring up controversy. So, for example, he said that everyone who demonstrated yesterday were terrorists. He uses that kind of inflammatory language. However, he's just appointed a new cabinet chief who is much more of an old-style Argentine politician who will be more interested in trying to make to do deals with parties of the centre and of the pro-dialogue opposition, as it's called. So these two different types of approaches are probably going to exist side by side over the next few months.
Andrew, just quickly before you go, can we have a look at Ecuador? Because it's been announced that the decision made to eliminate fuel subsidies will not be reversed, as demonstrators are demanding. What's the story on that?
The story is sort of similar in some ways to Argentina and in others different. One major difference is that the scale of austerity in Ecuador is for the moment less dramatic than in Argentina. There's a new right-wing president in Ecuador. In April, amid discussions with the International Monetary Fund, he increased VAT from 12 to 15%, which is a very unpopular move. And he's now looking at petrol and energy, at reducing petrol and energy subsidies. Initial suggestions are that petrol prices will go up 2.5%, 2.7%, not a massive percentage, but traditionally in Ecuador and in a lot of other Latin American countries, the increasing of petrol prices has led to major protests. It should also be said that the protests we've seen over the last day or so in Ecuador are at this stage still relatively small. We're talking hundreds of people rather than the thousands that were seen in Argentina.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was Andrew Thompson. Now, here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Leaders of the Group of 7 Nations are in Italy for a 3-day summit today. Members have agreed on a $50 billion loan for Ukraine, using interest on profits from Russia's frozen central bank assets as collateral. It's understood the money could reach Kyiv by the end of the year. Elsewhere, NATO members are set to take tougher action against Russian spies across the alliance in response to a campaign of hostile activities by Moscow, including acts of sabotage and cyber attacks. Countries, including Poland, Germany, Britain, and the Czech Republic, have reported incidents over the past weeks. And Japan's Dr. Yellow track testing bullet train will be retired in January, with plans for farewell events revealed today. Having always run on an undisclosed schedule, the goodbye celebration will give fans a chance to thank the bright locomotive for keeping the country's high-speed services safe. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Laura. The UK Labour Party hasn't had an election-winning manifesto in some 19 years. Well, today, the party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who's likely to be the next Prime Minister, made his big offer to the public. Given that all the polls indicate that Labour will win on July the 4th by a landslide, what lies ahead for Britain? Well, joining us now is Robin Brandt, former political correspondent for the BBC. Robin, this is the most precarious moment of the whole election for Keir Starmer. How's the launch gone and what's been the reaction?
Well, it's gone well. It was a heavily choreographed event in Manchester. We're halfway through this general election campaign now, 3 weeks in, and he was energised. He was confident. And he is managing to pull off what's known as the Ming vase strategy, which is to delicately walk across the marble floor with a Labour manifesto, a Labour Party wholeheartedly behind him, and try and deliver an election win on July the 4th. And the big thing about this manifesto was that we knew what was going to be in it. There are no big surprises. There are lots of pictures of Keir Starmer. The driving theme behind the whole campaign for his Labour Party is one of change, and he is a manifestation of that change. But the other important theme is one of stability. And much of the policy proposals at the heart of what a new Labour government might look like have been spoken about in the weeks leading up to this point, and have been detailed in releases to many newspapers as well. So there were no big surprises. And the overarching theme is one of change, but is also crucially one of stability. So far, the event appears to have gone very well, having watched most of it in the last hour or so.
Now, Labour's reputation was severely damaged by the fiasco of the Iraq War in the 2000s, and then in the Corbyn years, a coolness on NATO and nuclear weapons. This manifesto has a whole section called Britain Reconnected. What is Keir's vision for Britain on the world stage after years of Brexit diminishing it?
Well, look, I think primarily it is not dissimilar to that of the incumbent government as far as Ukraine is concerned. You could not get a paper between the two parties. And in terms of ongoing rigid support for Ukraine and its battle to defend its territory against the Russian invasion, then Labour is proposing and supporting exactly in the same way that the incumbent Conservative government is. There's a similar commitment on defence spending to hit that target of 2.5% of the UK's GDP by the end of the Parliament. I think more broadly, we've seen David Lammy, who is the shadow Foreign Secretary, so the man in charge of foreign policy for the Labour Party, talk in some detail about the overarching philosophy that they want is one of progressive realism. And this is being proponents of progressive ideas and trying to get the change that they want in terms of defending UK interests, defending democracies across the world, facing down authoritarian regimes as they see it, like China, but doing it in a realistic way, which basically means partnerships, an increased partnership, maybe along defence lines with the European Union, partnerships as well with other long-standing allies like Australia and, of course, the United States.
So, I mean, you talk about the European Union. Keir Starmer's previously wanted a much closer relationship with Europe, possibly even a second referendum. We know Brexit is very, very unpopular, but the manifesto definitely says that Britain will stay out of the EU. There's going to be no rejoining of the single market, no customs union, no changes on freedom of movement. Why would that be?
I think you need to see the UK's relationship with the European Union as far as Labour and certainly Keir Starmer and those around him are concerned through the prism of stability. They believe that the Brexit issue has been settled and it was incredibly divisive, both politically and, of course, the Labour Party faced much division within its own ranks as well. There are plenty within the trade union movement who were supporters of the UK leaving the European Union. But more than anything else, the idea for business, the idea for the UK as a whole of another referendum, 8-9 years after the issue was settled in 2016, is seen as being so destabilising by people like Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, his shadow chancellor, that they want to put to bed once and for all, certainly in the first term, any talk of another referendum, another repeat of such a divisive issue.
The manifesto also says that Britain will unequivocally remain a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, we know that's a dividing line within the Tories. Will this be a popular issue?
Well, look, I think there are other issues which Keir Starmer has touched on this morning, which are going to be far more important to voters, be they loyal Labour voters or be they swing voters in those constituencies which tend to be so important in general elections like this. But that is a dividing line, and that was one sought by Rishi Sunak and his Conservative Party to try and make clear that their offer to certainly their core Conservatives, and they're trying to see off an attack from the right as well, with a party led by Nigel Farage Reform, that their offer on the European Convention on Human Rights in dealing with illegal migration in the UK was very different to Labour. Rishi Sunak said, when it comes to either country or a court, I will always choose my country first. Keir Starmer, who is a barrister, a legal man by profession, believes that the UK needs to uphold the ECHR, uphold international bodies like that. And he believes that the UK will be a better place for doing so.
And just briefly before you go, Labour haven't won since Tony Blair. Do you think that Sir Keir Starmer's captured the public imagination well enough, or has he been overly cautious?
Look, they've certainly been cautious, but this is a party that Keir Starmer has changed hugely in a relatively short period of time. The last election in when Labour was led by Jeremy Corbyn, see the party get a huge dropping. And Keir Starmer, in a relatively recent short period of time, has brought his party undoubtedly back to the centre ground of British politics. And they look, if the opinion polls are right, as if they are heading for a resounding win. Has he captured the imagination? Is he a charismatic, energetic leader who people are calling out for? Well, maybe not. But he is the man, after 14 years of Conservative rule, in particularly very difficult last couple of years under Rishi Sunak's leadership in terms of pandemic and inflation, cost of living, migration. He is the man who seemed to present a very credible alternative. And that's why, if the opinion polls are right, it's looking like in 3 weeks' time he will be this country's next Prime Minister.
Robin Brandt, thank you very much indeed. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Chinese Prime Minister Li Qiang arrived in New Zealand earlier today in a rare visit to its closest partner amongst Western democracies. The two nations are keen to celebrate trade links, but New Zealand will have to balance this with concerns about South Pacific security. Giles Dexter is a political reporter at Radio New Zealand and joins us now from Wellington. Giles, many thanks for taking the time to speak to us. It's been 7 years since a Chinese visit like this. Why is this trip happening now?
Well, it's essentially to mark 10 years since the sort of cooperation agreement was signed. I mean, it's not like Chinese politicians haven't been visiting. Earlier this year, the foreign minister came, but this is, you know, the sort of most senior politician to visit in 7 years. And obviously the relationship has changed significantly since then. So while there was plenty of discussions on areas where the two countries cooperate, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, says it was actually about 50-50 between cooperation and areas where the two countries have disagreements.
Mm-hmm. So what's on the agenda for the visit?
Well, so they've held a bilateral meeting at Government House here in Wellington, and they sort of signed off on a number of upgrades to sort of agriculture and climate change agreements, sort of extension of visa-free travel and things like that. But of late, there have sort of been, increased security concerns that New Zealand wanted to stand up for. New Zealand is looking to join the second pillar of the AUKUS agreement, that agreement between Australia, the US and the UK, which would ensure nuclear-powered subs built for Australia. Now, New Zealand would not join that pillar because of its very strong anti-nuclear views. But there is that second pillar around information and technology sharing. Now, China sees that as interference in its affairs, that New Zealand would be joining in with the US in this sort of increasingly contested Pacific. So Christopher Luxon sort of got across his view that, look, this is just exploring at the moment, and, it is just about sharing technology. China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner, so it wouldn't want to rock the boat too much in that regard. Mr. Luxon says that they also discussed matters of human rights. New Zealand has consistently raised concerns around the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So he raised that, and also matters of foreign interference. New Zealand has recently called out Chinese-backed, or alleged that there have been Chinese-backed cyber attacks in New Zealand. And actually just recently today, there has been a new report of sort of many, many years stretching back of Chinese interference in New Zealand domestic matters. So he raised that, as well as events in the South China Sea, between China and the Philippines, just sort of wanting to get those matters across. He didn't really say what Premier Lee's response was to those issues, and Premier Lee himself did not take any questions from New Zealand media. So we're not entirely sure, what his views are on those matters that New Zealand spoke about. He did say that it's natural that these two countries don't always see eye to eye, but that the differences should not become a chasm, which was quite a strongly worded statement in that regard.
And just following on from the proposed membership of AUKUS, New Zealand is, of course, a member of the Five Eyes Security Alliance with the US, the UK, Canada and Australia. How does its relationship with China differ from the other members of Five Eyes?
Well, this is what they're trying to explore, and what AUKUS would mean differently to Five Eyes. There is that information sharing between our spy networks that is sort of sometimes seen as opposition, standing against what China's doing. AUKUS would be different again. At this point, we don't even know what Pillar 2 looks like, so it is just exploration. But China has sort of raised concerns that that New Zealand signing up to this would, that they would disagree with New Zealand signing up to this.
You mentioned the discussion of security in the Pacific and the South China Sea. New Zealand's become much more involved with this recently, actually sending, I think, some ships that way.
Yeah. So sort of participating in some of the exercises. So Christopher Luxon's one of his first major overseas trips that he did a couple of months ago was to Southeast Asia. He went to Thailand and Singapore, and also the Philippines, and he did sort of raise New Zealand's position that it did not want to see an escalation of tensions in the South China Sea. And in regards to the South Pacific, New Zealand's backyard, there has been increasing influence and investment from China in Pacific islands, sort of helping boost their infrastructure. Last week, the Prime Minister was in Niue, which is a tiny island nation in free association with New Zealand, but China has recently built much of the roads in Niue, and also given the Niuean government the cars that drive on those roads. And so New Zealand, its position is that it wants to be seen as a partner of choice in the Pacific, and that anyone coming into the South Pacific, China, whether it's the US, whether it's the EU, whether it's the UK, should be coming through the Pacific Islands Forum, which is this sort of central held organization which all the South Pacific countries, or all the Pacific countries belong to, and that, those sorts of matters should be dealt centrally in that regard.
And is this all part of Luxon trying to become more relevant, to make New Zealand more central on the world stage?
Yeah, I mean, like we've come, after those years of Jacinda Ardern, who was, a very prominent political figure on world affairs, which New Zealand maybe hasn't been quite used to for a while. And, there has been a change of government. There has been a change in, from a left wing to a centre-right government. And so Christopher Luxon, his background is in business. And so his view on foreign affairs is that any boosts to economy would sort of give New Zealand the edge when other countries sort of come knocking. And so he is trying to start to assert himself a little bit. He's packed out his calendar this year with international trips. He's actually off to Japan at the end of this week. And so he is trying to get out there and just sort of remind people that, hey, New Zealand is open for business because, we came out of COVID and, we're just wanting to try and get out there a little bit more and talk to people. Again, China is still New Zealand's largest trading partner, and New Zealand doesn't want to get left behind in that regard.
And in terms of that, I mean, we know that Australia has a trade surplus with China. That's due to iron ore and minerals. But as you say, New Zealand's much more dependent on Chinese imports. I wonder how that affects the relationship dynamic.
Well, yeah, the trade and tourism and things like that, that's what sort of New Zealand tries to rely on. They did just sign another extension of trade to allow sort of more fruit into the Chinese market and things like that. That's where New Zealand sort of sees itself. There has domestically within New Zealand sort of been more, exploration into minerals and reopening offshore gas exploration and things like that. So that could sort of start to be seen as things that could be added to the free trade to the trade agreement that New Zealand has with China. It has been a while since that was signed, and it is probably due for another look. And so New Zealand will be wanting to come to the table with that. Christopher Luxon isn't planning on visiting China this year, but it looks like the start of next year he'll go over, and he will probably want to start thinking about how we look at that trade agreement that we have with China, while also trying to explore trade agreements with India and the EU and the UK.
Giles, thank you very much indeed. That's Giles Dexter speaking to us from Wellington. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Here's a tale of two ditties. Well, not exactly ditties, national anthems. Nigerian national anthems, to be precise. Here's the first. It was written in 1960 and used until 1978.
Nigeria, we hail thee, our own dear native land. Though tribe and tongue may differ, in brotherhood we stand.
And here's the second, adopted in 1978.
Arise, O compatriots, Nigeria's call obey, to serve our fatherland with love and strength and faith.
But here's the thing. The first one is now back. Well, joining me from Lagos to discuss this is Wale Lawal, who is founder and editor-in-chief of The Republic, a journal of Nigerian affairs. Wale, many thanks for coming on to speak to us. Tell us about the first anthem, what it says and who it was written by.
Yes, sure. I think you absolutely nailed it in the intro. It was adopted in 1960. The lyrics were written by Lillian Jean Williams, who was a British expat living in Nigeria at the time, and the music was composed by Francis Berda. So the idea of this anthem was really to kind of usher Nigeria into this era of independence. So 1960 was the year that Nigeria gained independence from Britain. The whole idea is, Nigeria, we hail thee. And I think it's kind of known for having historically this message of unity and justice, the idea that, all men are equal in the eyes of the law. It's meant to be seen as a celebration of Nigeria's diverse cultural heritage. And its history is one of being a symbol of unity.
So what happened then in 1978? How did the second anthem come about?
Yeah, I mean, in 1978, we're looking at a country that has gone through a civil war. So just 6 years after we gained independence in 1966. We had we had ethnic tensions that were, that had been kind of bubbling on the surface. But these then culminated into a civil war that lasted for about 3 years, from about 1967 to about 1970. By 1978, you have a military government. So by this time, we had lost democracy. We were having different military regimes. And interestingly, we had a military government by General Olusegun Obasanjo by 1978. And of course, for everyone who knows Nigerian history, General Olusegun Obasanjo would return in 1999 as Nigeria's elected president. But back in 1978, we had this country that was still kind of dealing with the fractures of a civil war that were not resolved, that are still not resolved in many ways. And the idea of, the anthem being changed to A Rise of Compatriots was really meant to kind of give us this completely indigenous anthem reflecting Nigerian contributions. This new anthem was, composed by a group of 5 Nigerians. The music was composed by the Nigerian police band. And so it was meant to be a kind of Nigerian response, an assertion of independence that I think people had felt was quite missing, or at least the government had felt was quite missing in the previous anthem, Nigeria We Hail Thee.
And is it quite military in its origins and in its sound? I mean, does it reflect the junta?
Absolutely, I think that's a great observation. I think the Rise of Compatriots, even the idea of compatriots, is has a very, I'd say, militaristic essence. The whole idea there is we're being called to serve our country. It's an anthem of service, and I think even in the way that the lyrics, and when you think about the lyrics, it is an anthem of service. So I do feel that there is some military element in that. It reflected the military times in which it was created. But I also feel that they did make a strong case for having an indigenous Nigeria developed anthem, which was very different to the previous anthem. Where the previous anthem was calling for unity and and heritage, this was calling more for, or at least the selling point of this new anthem at the time was it was produced by Nigerians entirely.
So why have we gone back to the first one?
I think the general sentiment that we have at the moment is this need to revert to ideas of unity, ideas of heritage. The current president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, right from when he became Nigeria's president, made a big, I'd say a big speech or a big claim around, this being the time for healing. He ran a very divisive electoral campaign. I think for all of us who observed, the elections, these were very, very divided and divisive elections, and I think he has some part in that, and I think we all have to kind of admit that running into the elections with with a slogan such as Emi Lokan, or which translates to "It's my turn," and intentionally making that slogan in Yoruba. Really, I think hit some Nigerians in a way that they consider to be alienating, in a way that a lot of people consider to be sort of like ethnic, leading an ethnic campaign of bringing Yoruba people into office as opposed to bringing Nigerians into office. So it wasn't surprising when, on Inauguration Day last year, he made a big position around this being the time for healing, that we all need to move forward. Of course, these were, the election results had been contested. There were tribunal cases going on. And the big message at the time was, this is the time for healing. And I think that this is a direct result of that. This is I think thinking that is aligned with that, this idea of us returning to that anthem, being a sort of way of continuing that message of, a time for healing. Whether that message is convincing, though, is a different story, entirely.
So what's been the reaction to this within Nigeria?
It's been mixed. Nigeria, of course, is a very, very, I'd say it's a very plural society. So you do have people who are really pro the anthem. Of course, these happen to be, the president's supporters of his party. I think the main, supportive, comments that we've seen are people really talking about the historical significance, how patriotic the anthem is, the fact that it promotes a message of unity and justice, the fact that it puts culture and national identity first. These are areas that Nigerians have always considered lacking, the idea that we don't have a national identity, that we're all very fractured. And so you do have supporters who feel that this is, that this is kind of a way of resolving that. But of course, these supporters, interestingly, happen to be already supporters of the party and supporters of the president. On the other side, though, I think there's a lot of people who feel that, this change has come at a very, very strange time. There are other priorities. Nigeria is dealing with an economic crisis, record high inflation, food is expensive, fuel is expensive. And so there's a lot of questions around the political and economic timing of this policy, where people feel that there's a lot more that could have been, that should have been prioritized. And of course, this is also coming off the back of one of the big policy changes that the president made as soon as he became president, literally right there on his, in his inauguration speech, was removing, a decades old fuel subsidy program that really destabilized the local economy. So there's a big question around, around just the economic decisions that have been made recently and why those are not being given or why those are not being prioritized over changes such as these. Of course, there's also comments around the costs. What is it, what kinds of costs are we going to incur in changing the anthem, in re-educating the public, in changing textbooks, changing, the curriculum. All of those things, are things that people are really, really talking about, especially, again, given the economic crisis that we're in. The final thing, of course, is just the fact that the public doesn't necessarily feel carried along. This was a change that came all of a sudden, similar to the fuel subsidy change. And so a lot of people have kind of grown, I'd say, wary of these immediate sudden policy changes that don't really often seem well informed. It doesn't feel that that the public is being carried along. And of course, one big area of criticism, which is something that we've been following very strongly at the Republic, is how this kind of this is all coming around. Whether it's Democracy Day, we just celebrated Democracy Day yesterday. But also this is coming around the fact that, when we think about Nigeria's democracy at the moment, one of the biggest exercises of that democracy, which was the NSAS protest in 2020, a big symbol of that protest was how, at the end of that protest, there were reports that soldiers had shot unarmed protesters. There was video footage. This is, published by CNN. And in that video footage, you had protesters singing the previous national anthem, Arise, O Compatriots. And so for a lot of us who are, experiencing this policy change, we are asking ourselves questions such as, what does it mean to change the national anthem without having resolved, who gave the order to shoot protesters? The investigations into the shootings have still not been resolved. There has still been no one held accountable. And so that crisis is still unresolved. And so this feels in many ways a way of, just kind of changing the chapter abruptly. It all seems very unresolved at the moment.
Wale, thank you very much indeed. That was Wale Lawal talking to us from Lagos. Now, it's Thursday and that music intro can only mean one thing. It's time for the Global Countdown with Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Faye, where are you taking us this week?
Well, one thing I'm taking is not national anthems, Georgina, so don't worry.
For that.
Very interesting story, though, from Nigeria.
But why are they so universally terrible? Whichever country it is.
Exactly. There's some good ones, but I might agree with you on that. But what I did today is crazy. Tomorrow is the Euros, a big football competition here in Europe hosted by Germany. I looked at the number one songs from all the 24 countries that are taking place on the Euros, and I chose my best 5. And of course, sometimes there are known local artists at number 1, which means those countries were eliminated, by the way. I just want to clarify. We're going to start in Georgia. This is a little bit exotic and quite interesting. It's very traditional ballad heavy. Let's have a listen to the Ursa Band, a tribute to love. I kind of like it. I could hire Ursa Band for my wedding. You know.
Wait, is there something you're not telling me?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Fernando's getting mad.
But they are big in Georgia, and you know I couldn't understand. It's quite hard actually to translate some of the articles in Georgian, but they were everywhere on TV. Even the vocalist Georgi, he was on the lie detector on TV. I couldn't quite understand what he was lying or not about, but they are big. They are very much present in Georgia. Very traditional as well.
And who's at number 4?
Number 4, Ukraine, and I think you will love the story of this one. The name of the artist is Artem Pivovarov. He released an album called Your Poems, My Notes. So he performed. All the songs in this album are based in a Ukrainian literature work. And this song, I'll explain to you more, is called Drum. It's based on a poem called The Drum of Sorrow by Ukrainian poet Jao Shukrupi. So it's quite an interesting one, very dramatic. He sings with another Ukrainian artist called Klavdia Petrivna. Let's have a listen to Drum.
I love that.
It's fascinating, and I think you can, even if you don't understand Ukrainian, the poem that I've mentioned before, the song's about, and it's an exploration of sorrow and resilience. You can feel the resilience when you hear that song, if you know what I mean.
And really so symbolic of everything Ukraine is going through.
And it's quite beautiful, I think, this project. I mean, it's an album, but I can call it a project based on beautiful Ukrainian literature as well. So great entry at number 4.
And number 3.
Number 3, that's a funny one. I mean, it's from Slovenia. It's, you know, I looked at the video, it sounds mad. They are kind of in the Slovenian countryside. I didn't quite understand at the beginning. So, but I think the song is a humorous track. Anyway, and I'll tell you more about some of the lyrics, which I don't know if people will understand. But this is Hitmarscher in Ansabel Sil with Polka za 2 milione folka, which is polka for 2 million folk. Let's have a listen.
Zda ljubezen se spotika, jaščeva peho naš gance, polka ni za vas bosance, ad harmonika zašpila to.
I like it. It's humor back in the charts. And the lyrics, I mean, listen to the lyrics. I have hairy chest. She's milking cows in the barn. I do sports betting. It makes no sense. But you can see all those things if you look at the video as well. But then I was looking, of course, there's a very famous Slovenian comedian as part of this track. And, you know, even here in the UK countries, we used to have more of this comedic songs in the charts. But it kind of disappeared now. But in Slovenia, still all the way.
That's great. And Croatia?
Croatia is number 2. And, I mean, I'm so silly sometimes, Georgina, because the name of the guy is Nelson Mandela. And at the beginning I said, oh, he must love Nelson Mandela. Maybe it's a tribute to him. But no, it's connected to an expression called the Mandela effect, which is when people believe in something that didn't quite happen. I mean, that's news to me, but I did my research. But I love the beats of the song. It's proper Croatian hip-hop here. So let's have a listen to Nelson Mandela and Biba with Ankaran.
Kaže, čula me na radiju u taksiju I smijala se bucko, ajde dođi na gimnastiku. Mala, evo me stižem, ajde spusti to niže još, samo budi bez brige, reci gdje bi da idemo. Mala, evo me...
I think the song is excellent. I kind of don't care what he's talking about because this beat is so infectious. And the Croatian trap and hip-hop scene is huge. He's also the son of a very famous opera singer in Croatia, but he didn't follow her steps. I mean, he changed the rhythm. No opera, but hip-hop.
Really fascinating. All right then, so what are we going for at number 1?
I am a little bit biased, but we're going to Italy. And I say biased because we have Tony Effe, which is a very famous trap artist from Italy, but also Gaia, a very famous Italian-Brazilian singer. And the name of this track is simple, Sesso e Samba, Sex and Samba. Let's have a listen.
via. Via prima di farci a pezzi, non siamo troppo diversi. Come sesso e samba, sesso e samba. Come sesso e samba, sesso e samba. Sesso e samba, sesso e samba. Non siamo troppo diversi. Come sesso e samba.
When Brazilian bossa nova meets Italian trap, I mean, it's a good combo.
Listen, are you a football fan though?
Listen, I am a football fan when it comes to big competitions. All the rest of the months, couldn't care less. But when it's Euros or World Cup, I kind of like it, you know?
So all of these, as you pointed out, are playing in the Euros. Now, we know where you rank them musically. How do you rank them in terms of where they might come in the competition?
Can I be honest? I am not a big expert on Slovenian football, but you know what? I would love to see Slovenia winning because, you know, it's a fairly small country. There'll be a surprise for everyone. But I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of emails. Fernando, Slovenia has no chance. But I will bet on that.
You will bet on them.
I will bet on Slovenia.
Listen, I have to close the programme now because we have important discussions about your upcoming wedding to talk about.
I have a Georgian band already that I can hire then, so that's great.
Fernando Pacheco, thank you very much. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAviney, our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Tamsin Howard. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.